is Roger Capello. I'm bringing you My Week at the Club, episode number 71. After a bit of a break, we took some vacation, and also I've been lazy about putting out videos. But this week I had a game that was a little unusual in that I was a serious underdog against Rob King, and it was a national master. But before I dive into that game, I'd like to chat a little bit about the astronomy topic of the week, which this week I've chosen to speak about the Lagrange points. Okay, so these are, you may have heard of them. They're some orbital points that are special in any two-body orbital system. So these were discovered by Euler and Lagrange a couple hundred years ago. And in a two-body system like the Earth and the Sun, as the Sun orbits around the Earth, or if you consider just the Moon orbiting around the Earth, that two-body system, there's some very special points. So normally if you plop something down like a satellite anywhere in the Earth-Moon system, it will move under the gravitational attraction of either the Earth or the Moon, and it will wander around in some sort of funny orbit, and maybe not even a stable orbit. But there are 5 special points that in a system like the Earth and Moon, called Lagrange points, where if you plop something down, it tries to stay where it is, where the forces are balanced out. So these are called L1 through L5, not too imaginatively. And L1 through L3, L1, L2, and L3 are all on a straight line through the two bodies. So here it's showing the Earth and the Moon as the 3 points lie along that Earth-Moon line. And L1, as you can see, is between the Earth and the Moon. It's not quite where it's shown in this diagram. It's about a sixth of the way from the Moon toward the Earth. So only about 61,000 kilometers away from the Moon, closer to the Moon. L2 is a similar distance on the other side of the Moon, farther away from us than the Moon is. And L3 is actually in the opposite direction from the Earth and from the Moon entirely. It's in the anti-Moon direction. And at those 3 points, the forces balance out. The L4 and L5, which you can see above and below, are at 60-degree isosceles triangle that they form with the Earth and the Moon. And those also are Lagrange points. You can make some kind of simple arguments about why L1, L2, and L3 exist. So L1, for example, between the Earth and the Moon, it's orbiting around, I should have said these are fixed in the frame that orbits with the Moon. So if you're orbiting around at the same with a 1 month period, but you're only at L1's distance, then you're not far enough out to have a sufficient centrifugal force to balance the gravity of the Earth. Basically the Moon stays where it is because it gets flung out because it's going around in a circle, if you want to look at it that way, centrifugal force, and it's getting pulled in by the Earth, and those two things balance right at the Moon's position. If you're a little closer to us than the Moon is, the pull of the Earth is stronger and the centrifugal force is not as strong, and so the Earth would win out, you would think. However, there's one more player in this, and that's the Moon. So if you come up a little bit off the surface of the Moon tries to pull you back down toward the Moon. And at that L1 point, a tug of the Earth and the Moon and the fact that there's some centrifugal force all balance out. And that's a point where you could stay. Similarly for L2, on the other side, I won't go into each of the different cases, and L3. L4 and L5 are a little harder to understand. You can look at it with a sort of an energy plot, which is shown here. They're using the third dimension to show potential energy, like a hill, where you would go downhill. And in this case, it looks like it's the Sun and the Earth that we're looking at. But if you can see that L1 there between the Sun and the Earth is on a ridge. And if it were a little closer to the Sun, it would go inward. If we're a little farther away, it would go out toward the Earth. But it can balance on that ridge. It's actually what's called a saddle point by mathematicians. It goes up on the two sides and down on the other two sides. And it's not a stable point. If you give it a little nudge, it'll go rolling downhill. But L4 and L5 are actually along that kind of the ridge along the Earth's orbit there, are a little dense in the system. And they're only stable if the more massive body is at least 25 times the mass of the lighter body. But there is a little dent there and a depression in the potential surface. And if the body that's out there gets wiggled a little bit, gives it a little nudge, it'll actually just roll around inside of that depression, so to speak. So it orbits around that L4 or L5 point. Okay, so what are these things good for? Well, they're really handy for space travel and for spacecraft. So the L1 point, for example, for the Earth-Moon system, or I mean, sorry, for the Sun and the Earth, is about 1,000,000 miles or 1.5 million kilometers toward the Sun from the Earth. And if you park a satellite out there, a spacecraft, it's not stable. It's going to have to use some gas jets to maintain its position, but it will try to orbit around a little bit in that region, and you won't have to use very much propellant to stay right around in that area. And what it's good for is that it's a special position. You stay fixed at that point between the Earth and the Sun. And so there's the SOHO spacecraft that takes some gorgeous pictures of the Sun like this, that is there always looking at the Sun. And there's also another spacecraft called Discover, and I think it was Al Gore's satellite at one point, looking back at the Earth. And the nice thing about being at that point is that the Earth is always, since you're between the Earth and Sun, you always have the Sun over your shoulder. So you're looking at the Earth, and the Earth is always lit up. You always see a full Earth, and you can watch the Earth entirely lit up. And here are a couple of neat little video clips from that Discover satellite. The first one here showing the moon going between the satellite, the spacecraft, and the Earth, and you can see it go across. You see how dark the moon is. Also should point out that the moon is it's not quite as big as it looks like here, because it's 1,000,000 miles out, and the moon's 250,000 miles from the Earth. So it's actually closer to the moon than it is to the Earth. And so the moon looks a little bigger than it really is. So the moon's only about 1/4 of the size of the Earth. Here it looks like it's about 1/3 of the size. But it's interesting that it's such a dark body. Also, this next video here shows a solar eclipse, shows that shadow of the moon going across the Pacific. And you can see it sort of outraces the natural rotation of the Earth as it goes across. So that's kind of cool. The L2 point, which is away from the Sun, in the opposite direction of the Sun from the Earth, so out on the Earth-Sun line, but out beyond the Earth by about 1,000,000 miles, is where the Webb Space Telescope is going to go. And it's going to be in an orbit out there, keeping station right around the L2 point, and shows in this little animation from NASA. And that's advantageous because it's an infrared satellite and has real problems with the infrared radiation from the Sun and also from the Earth, heating it up, causing noise so that it can't take as good images. So it has a infrared heat shield on one side of the spacecraft. And so if they stick it out here at L2 and put the heat shield between it and the Earth and Sun, then it doesn't get that infrared from the Earth and Sun, and instead just sees the black cold part of space to take its images. So that's what it's doing. Also, another spacecraft that used L1 and L2 was called Artemis P1. It was back in 2010, I think. 2010, 2011, that time frame. And that was L1 and L2 in the Earth-Moon system. And here you actually see the rather exotic orbit it had, first orbiting around the L2 point, and then doing a transfer maneuver to get over to orbit around the L1 point for a while, before it finally ended up diving in and doing an orbit just around the moon proper. So they're pretty interesting things. The L4 and L5 are the stable Lagrange points that are 60 degrees away in the orbit of the moon around the Earth, or the orbit of the Earth or Jupiter, in fact, around the sun. In fact, in the case of Jupiter, the Lagrange points L4 and L5 have gathered some asteroids through the eons, I guess I should say, over a very long period of time. And those are called the Trojan asteroids that are the leading and following Trojan points, Lagrange points in Jupiter's orbit. And the Earth itself actually gathers a little bit of debris from time to time in the Lagrange L4 and L5 Lagrange points and little moonlets, but they aren't very stable because of the perturbing influence of the sun, and so they don't stay around for too long. And finally, last but not least, there was the L5 Society back in the day, back in the 70s, when I was a grad student. Jerry O'Neill was trying to get people to build space habitats, big cylindrical space habitats, and he wanted to place them at one of the Lagrange points. They nominally chose L5, which is a trailing point. They figured that'd be a good place to put a habitat in space that people could live in because it's stable and you wouldn't really need to do anything to keep it orbiting in the same place. It would be in orbit, in space, but not moving around all the time and not having a decaying orbit or being subject to the sorts of problems that you have close into the Earth. So those are kind of a quick thumbnail sketch of the Lagrange points. I think I probably should get on to the promised chess game now, though. Okay, so here's my game against National Master Rob King, who outrated me, I guess, by about 280 points or so in this game. So I was a considerable underdog, and as you'll see, I play in a at times uninspired way, but certainly trying not to lose. In fact, I didn't really follow the normal prescription for playing against a stronger player, which is that you actually do best if you complicate the game, because anything can happen in complications. And usually if you play a quiet game, the stronger player has, better positional understanding and will eventually make good with that positional understanding, and you'll end up losing the game as a result. But that didn't happen here. Okay, so I'm going to go through the game. It was an interesting endgame, and that's really where the key moments came. And so I'll go through the game kind of in a Gadmater style, if you've ever seen that YouTube channel. He's a guy who plays through the games pretty quickly with a minimum of commentary, but that's fine. So I played e4, Rob played g6, which looked like a modern defense. I went ahead and played d4, bishop g7, knight c3, and now c6. So he's starting to challenge on the light squares. The bishop already challenges on the dark squares. I played knight f3. In fact, here I was thinking about playing f4, which is actually a playable line, would be more aggressive and probably would have been more along that strategy that I first talked about. But I didn't do that. Instead, I played quietly with knight f3. And Rob played d5. And now we've gotten into a transposed really into more of a Gurgenidze variation of a Caro-Kann defense, where black fianchettos his dark squared bishop. Okay, so I just went for quick development. He, threatened to trade off my knight, basically. It's not pinned. I developed my other bishop because under some of these lines here, this d pawn can become weak. He could trade off my knight, and now then I would only have the one defender, and he has two attackers with his bishop and queen. So I defend it again, and he does, in fact, open up the d file. I take back, but now my d pawn is defended, and he makes a characteristic Caro-Kann knight maneuver here. I encourage him to exchange the bishop. If he doesn't exchange it and goes back to e6, then one of my knights is going to attack it right away. So he does exchange, and I take back. And at this point, I was fairly happy. My pieces are developing. My bishops have reasonable squares that they're on. The knight looks a little clumsy there, but it is right in the center of the board. But of course, he can challenge that knight with this, as I was saying, with this idea that comes up a lot in the Caro-Kann, of the two black knights on d7 and f6. I decided to go ahead and let him trade that night, though, because the time that I gained would be, well spent in finishing my development. He traded the knight, and as I expected, came after my bishop. Um, my original plan was to retreat the bishop either to f3 or d3 to one of these squares, and to retain the pair of bishops. But I decided not to go with that plan, and instead kind of kept with the idea of allowing exchanges and developing as quickly as I could with the playing queen f3. He went and took the bishop, and I took back. So now I no longer have the bishop pair advantage. We both just have a dark squared bishop. But I felt that I had a little lead in development here, and I didn't really have any significant weaknesses. And he played queen d5, which is an interesting move. It offers a queen trade right away, obviously. If I retreat my queen, then his queen is posted in the center of the board and has become quite active. That didn't really appeal to me. So I went ahead and exchanged. And now we have equal pawns, but they're somewhat unbalanced. It's a kind of a Carlsbad pawn structure here where we have a half-open C file and a half-open E file. I went ahead and decided to play on that half-open E file, threatening maybe for my next move to play my bishop out to G5. But he played a move I didn't even consider, but in retrospect, as soon as he played it, I decided it was quite good. The queens are off the board, the king and most of the minor pieces, so the kings are safe out in the center, and it's time for the king to become a fighting piece. And as you'll see in the game, his king is a more active piece than my king is, and as a result, it almost cost me the game. I went ahead and buttressed that dark square diagonal to blunt the bishop along that diagonal. He went and occupied his half-open file. And now I wanted to stop his minority attack. He was threatening to play b7, b5 here, and then to b4, trying to make a weakness on c3. So instead I beat him to the punch with a4. He took time out to bolster his center. And then I played bishop f4. I maybe here should have considered playing a5. That might have been a better move, making it more difficult for him to play on the queen side. I didn't do that. I played bishop f4 because I figured that his advantage in this position, besides having a slightly more active king, is that he has the better bishop, obviously. He has the dark squared bishop, and his main pawn chain here is on light squares, whereas my main pawn chain is on these dark squares. And so he has the better bishop. So I was thinking at this time about trading off the bishop, or at least getting it onto a diagonal where it exerted some influence. He played his bishop back, which was an interesting move. Maybe he was, at least my thinking during the game was that maybe he was encouraging me to play my bishop to e5, which I think would have been a mistake, because then his bishop could have come immediately to h6, in which case he would have had this nice long diagonal and been a very active piece. So I didn't do that. Instead, I played g4. The idea behind this move was to get my king up off the back rank and start to bring it toward the center where it could be more active. Also, in some variations, it's helpful to restrain the pawns, the black pawns with my pawn on g4. But it does give him time to play a5. And now all of a sudden I've got a potential problem over here. He has ideas in mind, maybe at some point of playing his pawn to b5, not right away, it would have to be defended first. Another idea is to play his rook to a6 to b6, and to threaten my pawn here on b2, which is a weakness. And he's got control now of this b4 square, which makes it difficult for me to undo that weakness before he gets around to attacking it. So as a result, I played my bishop back to d2, putting in a second attack and at least giving the notion that I might be able to play b4. He improved his bishop to get it on a better diagonal. He's still on this long diagonal that he was, but now he also occupies his second diagonal here and is threatening to come to one of those squares if I let them fall out of my control. And I played rook to c1, thinking at the time that I wanted to play b4, but I'm not sure that that was such a good plan. If I had done it immediately in this position, if I had played b4, then he can just trade off pawns and play the rook down to c2. And I didn't like the looks of his rook penetrating into my position on c2. Actually, in this position right here, Stockfish, instead of playing rook to c2, interestingly enough, wants to just immediately play rook to c4, where it eyes my pawn weaknesses on b4 and d4, especially the isolated pawn on d4. So instead of that, I defended that c pawn, and then he opened up the center. It felt like it was a mistake to me during the game, but Stockfish doesn't disapprove that badly. The eval went down slightly. The reason I thought it was bad was because of the isolated pawn that it creates on d5. But as you'll see, that's not too big of a problem for him. I exchanged the pawns and took control of the square that he would like to push the isolated pawn to. First restrain and then blockade, as Nimzovich used to say, or at least he once said. He also decided to fight for that square, also put pressure on my a pawn, both of those squares that he's eyeing now. And so I moved my rook over to help fortify the d4 square. He brought his king up, and I played bishop to d4. As Rob pointed out after the game, I did this quite quickly. My idea was that there would be some trades going on that square. I also had the idea that he might totally fall asleep and bring his other rook to the center or something, allowing me time to play b2 to b3, trapping his rook. He's a master. He's not going to do that. I probably shouldn't even have considered, but sometimes it's good just to put those things out there. But it did cause the eval to shift in the wrong direction, in Black's direction, by about a point here, even though it still wasn't a full pawn, but it gave him a modest small advantage after my move. Trades off the bishops and then attacks my rook, and now my rook is attacked twice. I have to do something about it. I could exchange it. I didn't want to exchange it because then that would allow his king to penetrate on my queen side. He could take back with the king. So instead I attacked his weak pawn, and then after that he doesn't want to be caught just defending that pawn, so he exchanges the rooks. So we're down to the rook and pawn endgame at this point. And he gets the open file, his first to it, but I had planned all along, maybe not all along, but within the last few moves I had planned in this event to play my king over to f1 to keep his rook from coming down to e1 or e2. It actually, in this position here, Stockfish suggests an immediate rook to f4, which is probably something I should have looked at, because I was thinking about getting to f4, but I felt I had to play my king to f1 first. And what I didn't appreciate is how quickly that opportunity of getting to f4 would shut down with Rob's good move of g5. And now he has a modest advantage. However, he had a better move, it turns out. At this point, instead of playing g5, he could have played his rook to e4. And the idea here is he's attacking my pawn back here. He's threatening to win a pawn immediately on d4. Rook takes, pawn takes, king takes. If I move my rook off of the rank, then he can take this pawn on a4. And so what the line would continue would be that I'd be more or less forced to trade off the rooks and go into a king and pawn endgame. But in this king and pawn endgame, he's much better. I can keep his king out temporarily from my queen side with this move, but the advantage is that his king, as in the real game, is much more centralized than mine is, where I can do things. And he's going to be, and this pawn is already advanced into my territory. Finally, he's going to end up in a lot of these positions with a, well, I guess it's a little early to talk about that, but right now he has a couple of tempo moves. He has b7, b6, a7, a6, h7, h6, f7, f6, a number of moves that he could tempo with, or actually more likely at some point he'll just play f5 because he wants to make a pass pawn with that pawn majority he has on the king side. So that actually is much better for him. I guess a few moves more, yeah, after f5 it would look like this. Looks pretty good for black. Instead, like I say, he played g5, which I didn't like because it kept my rook from going to f4. And so I immediately challenged it, but it turns out that's a blunder. And what I should have done was to just play f3. That keeps his rook out of e4. And if he plays his rook down to e3, I can simply play my king up and evict the rook. So that's not a possibility for him. So that would have been a much better move for me. Instead, I played f4. And now he has basically a winning move, but he didn't play it. So what he did play was f6. Instead, what he should have played in this position is the same idea as in the previous move, was to play the rook down to e4 immediately. And now I've got a bit of a problem, because if I go ahead and take the rook on e4, like so, then I have nothing better really than to either take that pawn or to push my pawn. Either way, he's got this passed e pawn now. And furthermore, what the real problem is that his king is penetrating into the position. So, I'm temporarily one pawn ahead. White is temporarily one pawn ahead. But this king is coming in over here to mop up the queen side. And there's no way to keep him out. I won't run through this variation, but there's no, if you run through it, it turns out that he wins the race easily before I do. Okay, so instead of that, though, he played his pawn to f6. And after the game, thinking in his head, he said, oh yeah, that pawn to f6 move was probably a bad move. And he hit the nail on the head. So that gave me time to play king f2, keeps him out of e3. Played rook t6, I think with at least what it felt like his idea was to come over and attack my weak pawn on b2. So I decided at this point then to try to get active and push my f pawn. And if he takes a timeout, I'm going to have a weak pawn here on b2. But if he comes over and attacks and allows my rook to come back and over to the e file, then I can penetrate. And if I win that f pawn, or just play rook to e6. So, if you look at a line like, rook over, rook back, say king up here, and rook here, and now if the king were to come in to win my a pawn, say, I have this move. And this is very bad for him, because either I win the f pawn or he gives me a pass pawn that's going to promote in a couple moves. So this is not a line that black would want to go down. So instead of that, what he did was to play rook to e7, and I had time then to play b3, which keeps his king out of my queen side. Pawn up. I played rook back. I realize now this is really not a Gadmater style. I'm saying far more than he normally does. I should have been quicker. And so the idea is to move my rook over to e file now to oppose his rook. He penetrates with his rook, and I come over and basically say, well, either trade or give me the file. Well, he chose to, he didn't do either, but he let me trade, basically. And so I initiated the trade. And now we've finally gotten to a king and pawn endgame. And king and pawn endgames are interesting because they, it's often, it's like you're poised on a knife edge. They could fall either way if there's one misstep by either side. And you don't want to trade into a king and pawn endgame if you have a choice, unless you're winning it or drawing it, if that's what you're trying to do. Because your resources sometimes are not nearly as great as they would be in a rook and pawn, or when there are pieces on the board. You have some more opportunities. Although in this game there are some resources that are found just with the kings and the pawns, as you'll see. That's pretty interesting. So I make what should have been a losing mistake here. I played king to e3, which looked like a very reasonable move. My thinking, well, was that his king's more centralized. I have to get my king centralized as quickly as possible. He has an advantage in that he has a tempo move. So whenever he needs it, he can play h7, h6. So if we get into a mutual Zugzwang position where neither one of us wants to move, he can make that h-pawn move, and then I'll have to blink first, and then he'll maybe get to do something with his king or whatever the advantage is that he's getting out of Zugzwang. It turns out that the correct move at this point, although it's sort of beyond my pay grade, would have been not to play king e3, but instead play king e2. And then if he comes up, to oppose him and go back and forth. Now, if he in this position, after I play king to d, sorry, let's go back. Okay, now I play, nope, not e3. Okay, right in this position where I made the foolish move, and I should have played king e2. Okay, he plays king d5. If I play king d2 and he plays oh6, say, thinking that, aha, Roger goes into e3, then I can grab the opposition. This is bad because now I have this c4 move, and his king can't move to where he has to move, and his king can't go to where it continues to defend the e-pawn. So I'm going to win that e-pawn. He gets put into Zugzwang there. So that would be bad. But if he does it correctly here and just moves back and forth with his king, there's no way for either of us to make progress. Instead, I play king to e3. Okay, this is a loss. However, black has to find the correct counter move. I should point out that at this point in the game, we were both short on time. I don't have my scorebook in front of me, but Rob ended with about 2 minutes on the clock, and I had 6 minutes, something like that. I was a little bit ahead in time, but so we didn't have time for really long analysis at this point over the board. So he played king to d5, and that's not the winning move. The winning move at this point, and that's pure equality if you go to d5, would have been to play to e5 immediately. And then if I go ahead and make that c4 move, which I showed in that last variation, the crucial difference here is that he hasn't burnt that tempo with his h-pawn, and now he can go ahead and make that tempo move. Then my king has to budge. I don't have any moves, and his king is able to enter my position, and now it's going to come over here and win my b pawn, and with it the game, b and a pawns. Okay, so interesting stuff. But now here's where we get to the killer. So he played king to d5 instead, and I took the opportunity to play b4. I thought this was safe because I didn't think if he exchanged pawns that would be a problem for me. And actually I was right. But while I was sitting there after I made my move, I said, gee, what if he plays b5? That's one of those nasty pawn sacrifices. And sure enough, that's what he did. And then I thought I was lost. It turns out that b5 is a mistake, that really he shouldn't have done that. Should have played that tempo-wasting move h6. But the reason b5 is lost is sort of instructive. And that's, I mean, well, it's not lost. I mean, it's drawn, I should say. The reason it's drawn is that I have one possibility. If you haven't already looked at the score there on the side, which here I'll run it off so you can't look at it anymore. I suppose I could, in post-editing here, I could block that for a while. Then you could take a few seconds here. I'll pause the video and look at it and see if you can find a saving resource for white. Okay, the threat is that after pawn takes, the white pawn is stoppable by his king, and the black pawn is not. So maybe I should show that line first. The idea is that pawn takes. He's in my square, so if I try to run, he can just stay in the square like that. But eventually I'm going to run out of moves, and my king is not going to be able to stay in the square of both of his pawns. He has two passed pawns here on A4 and E4. And if I take time to take the pawn on E4, then this A pawn advances, and I'm going to be out of the square here, out of that square that stops the pawn. And if I come over to stop the A pawn, then the E pawn is going to go in. So that does not work. Okay, go ahead and see if you can find out what the idea is, though, that saves the only move to save the game. Okay, well, congratulations if you've seen it. The saving resource here was C4. Okay, see how many pawns we can put on pre's here. And this does the trick. If he has two ways to take, he can't afford to let me take his B pawn. He has to take my pawn one way or the other. And if he takes with his pawn here, then which is what he did. Actually, I should say what he didn't do first. If he takes with the king, okay, then pawn takes pawn on my part is now winning. Okay, this has lost the game because if he plays pawn takes pawn, my pawn is going to get there first. I'm going to stop his pawn from queening, right? You can see that easily. Or if he instead, oh, sorry. Okay. If instead of taking the pawn, okay, so if king takes, sorry, and pawn takes, if he plays the king back to try to catch my pawn, then I go ahead and push it, and he has to stay up even with it, and then I just take the B pawn, and now that's a protected pass pawn. He can't take the B pawn because the A pawn would run, and so that's a stable configuration. And I just mop up his E pawn and run over here and eat the other pawns. So that would be a loss for black. So of course he wouldn't do that. He did the right thing, which is to take with the pawn, and then what I have to do is push the pawn, and now I have this protected pass pawn that he has to hang around with his king in front of. He has these two dangerous-looking C and E pawns, but it turns out I can stop them. So he played C3, and that's this typical kind of pawn formation where these squares are under attack here, and there's no way to get over to take this guy. And if I ever come over to try to get there through D4, then I've stepped out of this guy's square, and he'll end up promoting. But I have a move. I can just play King E2. And after he moves, now King D1 would be a bad mistake. I suppose I should show that because it's kind of cute, because then he can push the E pawn, and if I go after either one of his pawns, say the C pawn, then he pushes the other one, and now things have gotten really critical. I'm going to end up losing this. But of course, you don't do that. Instead, you just go back to where you were. And so I tempo back and forth. And there's nothing for him to do. Any try to win is going to it's going to try to it's going to end up losing the game for either one of us. So that's what happened. It ended up being a draw. I was happy. Rob's a very strong player, and a draw against him is a good result. And it was as I said, not a very inspired game on my part. I felt with the going through with all these trades and just trading things off in the center and getting myself almost into a losing king and pawn endgame. But after the rooks get traded off, it is barely holdable, but I didn't do a clean job of holding it, but I guess it was just good enough given the amount of time we had on the clocks. Okay, well, that's enough time. That's it for now. So this is Roger Capello saying goodbye from my week at the club.